In the medical literature, there are documented cases of children born without a cerebral cortex. The condition is called hydranencephaly. According to traditional neuroscience, which places human awareness squarely in the cortex, these children should be entirely void of conscious experience. Yet when their parents hold them, they smile. When they are uncomfortable, they cry. They show distinct signs of joy, frustration, and preference. This observation forces a radical reevaluation of where consciousness actually lives.
Today we are examining affect-based theories of consciousness. For decades, the dominant scientific models have treated consciousness as a byproduct of higher-level thinking. Reflection, attention, integration, and prediction, these cognitive processes are usually seated in the cerebral cortex, but a growing movement in affective neuroscience challenges this top-down approach. Researchers like Antonio Damasio, Jaak Pank-Sepp, and Mark Solms argue that consciousness does not begin with complex thought. It begins with feeling. They propose that our most fundamental sense of being alive is rooted deep in the evolutionarily ancient brainstem driven by the body's need to survive.
The shift here is profound. If you look at the history of philosophy and science, René Descartes essentially set the rules of engagement with his famous declaration, "I think, therefore I am." That placed the premium on reasoning and language. For most of the 20th century, neuroscientists searched for the neural correlates of consciousness in the brain's outer layers, focusing on visual perception or working memory. The affect-based approach turns that hierarchy upside down. It suggests that before an organism can think about its environment, it must first care about its own survival. That caring manifests as basic feelings: hunger, pain, warmth, fear.
Let us break down the biological mechanics of this claim. Antonio Damasio has written extensively about this, particularly in books like The Feeling of What Happens. He outlines a layered approach to the self, starting with something he calls the proto-self. How does that biological mapping actually generate subjective experience?
It creates an interesting contrast with other models we have discussed, such as higher-order theory. Higher-order theory posits that a mental state only becomes conscious when a higher-level cognitive process reflects upon it. In that framework, consciousness requires a degree of internal observation. Affect-based theorists argue that higher-order theory demands too much cognitive overhead. If you touch a hot stove, the pain does not wait for a secondary cortical mechanism to flag it as a conscious event. The pain is intrinsically felt the moment it registers in the deeper structures of the brain. Jaak Pank-Sepp, who coined the term affective neuroscience in the late 1990s, was adamant about this. He categorized what he called primary process consciousness. This is the raw, unreflective experience of basic emotions and drives, which is generated in ancient subcortical regions. For Pank-Sepp, experience does not need to be observed by a higher cognitive function to exist. It simply needs to be felt.
We should also measure this against global workspace theory. That model compares consciousness to a theater where information is broadcast to the rest of the brain so various cognitive systems can access it. Global workspace focuses heavily on the mechanics of information distribution.
The critique from the affect-based perspective is that global workspace theory explains how information is shared, but it ignores why that information matters to the organism in the first place. Imagine a sophisticated computer network sharing data across multiple servers. That is a global workspace, but the computer does not care about the data. Affective theories argue that feeling provides the necessary valence, the intrinsic sense of good or bad, pleasant or painful. Mark Solms, a prominent neuropsychoanalyst, argues that without this affective valence, information processing is just blind computation. Feeling is what gives information its weight and urgency.
Then there is integrated information theory, or IIT, which attempts to quantify consciousness mathematically. IIT suggests that consciousness is determined by the degree to which a system's information is both differentiated and integrated. It focuses on the structure of the system.
Integrated information theory is elegant in its structural description, but affect-based theorists point out that it struggles to explain the actual content of experience. Why does pain hurt? Why does pleasure feel rewarding? IIT can calculate a value for how integrated a neural network is, but it does not account for the biological imperative behind those networks. Affect-based theories insist that consciousness is fundamentally tied to flesh and blood, to the biological imperative of staying alive. It is not just about complex wiring, it is about survival machinery that generates a felt sense of value.
That brings us to predictive processing. This framework views the brain as an inference machine, constantly generating predictions about sensory inputs and updating its models to minimize prediction errors. It has become a dominant paradigm in cognitive science.
Predictive processing is highly compatible with affect-based theories if you look at the brainstem's role. Mark Solms has explicitly merged these ideas. He suggests that the brain's homeostatic needs, like the need for glucose or water, are the baseline predictions. When the body state deviates from those needs, it generates a prediction error. But Solms adds a crucial layer. That prediction error is felt as unpleasure or distress. The successful resolution of that error is felt as pleasure. So, predictive processing provides the computational mechanism, but affect provides the subjective currency. Error minimization is not a sterile mathematical function. It is driven by the felt reality of suffering and satisfaction.
Let us dive deeper into the anatomy, specifically the brainstem, which keeps coming up in this discussion. Solms makes a rather controversial claim. He argues that the upper brainstem is intrinsically conscious, while the cerebral cortex is intrinsically unconscious. He states that the cortex only borrows its consciousness from the brainstem. Solms bases that argument on clinical evidence. We return to the hydranencephalic children we mentioned earlier. Despite lacking a cerebral cortex, these children demonstrate primary affective consciousness. They wake up, they sleep, they recognize familiar caregivers, and they exhibit clear emotional responses. Solms points to structures like the periaqueductal gray, or PAG, located in the midbrain. If the PAG is damaged, even if the entire cortex remains intact, the patient falls into a coma or a vegetative state. The subjective mind disappears. Conversely, patients can lose vast swaths of their cortex and still retain a basic sense of self and emotional awareness. This leads Solms to conclude that the core of our subjective experience, the conscious id, as he calls it, referencing Freud, resides in the brainstem. This localization of consciousness in the brainstem must invite significant pushback from the broader neuroscience community. The cortex has been the focal point of consciousness research for decades. What are the primary critiques of the affect-based model?
The pushback is substantial. Neuroscientists like Heather Berlin argue that Solms and others are conflating wakefulness with the actual contents of consciousness. Berlin points out that the brainstem provides the necessary arousal, the biological on switch, but that arousal alone does not constitute a rich, subjective experience. From the mainstream perspective, a patient in a persistent vegetative state might have intact brainstem functions governing sleep-wake cycles and basic reflexes, but they lack the cortical activity required for true awareness. Critics argue that while the brainstem is a necessary precondition for consciousness, it is not sufficient on its own to generate the nuanced phenomenal experience we associate with being a conscious entity.
That distinction between the on switch and the content of the broadcast is a critical nuance. It questions whether raw affect, a sheer feeling of discomfort, can even be called consciousness if there is no cognitive apparatus to locate or interpret that discomfort.
That is the dividing line in the debate. Can a feeling exist in a vacuum? If a brainstem generates a chemical signal corresponding to pain, but there is no cortex to map that pain to a specific body part or contextualize it in time and space, is it still a conscious experience? Affective neuroscientists like Panksepp would argue yes, the raw, unadulterated suffering is the most fundamental form of consciousness. Cortical theorists argue no. Without the cortex to interpret the signal, it is just a biological reflex.
The implications of this debate extend far beyond human neuroanatomy. If consciousness originates in the brainstem rather than the highly developed human neocortex, it drastically alters how we view the animal kingdom.
It forces a complete reassessment of animal welfare. The brainstem structures responsible for basic affect, the periaqueductal gray, the hypothalamus, the superior caulici, are evolutionarily ancient. They are conserved across species. All mammals possess them. Birds possess them. Even reptiles and fish have homologous structures. If Jacques Panksepp is correct that primary process consciousness is generated in these ancient neural territories, then subjective experience is not a rare trait exclusive to humans and a few higher primates. It is a widespread biological phenomenon. An injured fish might not possess the cognitive capacity to reflect on its pain or anticipate the future, but it feels the negative valence of the injury. The pain hurts. This perspective dissolves the sharp boundary between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom.
It presents a biological continuum rather than a sudden cognitive leap. The implications for ethics are clear. If a creature can feel, it has a stake in its own existence, regardless of its ability to solve puzzles or use language.
Damasio speaks to this when he discusses the evolutionary function of feelings. Homeostatic feelings did not evolve to give us a rich inner life for the sake of poetry or philosophy. They evolved because they are highly efficient survival mechanisms. A feeling of hunger compels an organism to seek food much more effectively than a neutral, unconscious calculation of caloric deficits. Feelings force the organism to act. They are biological imperatives translated into subjective experience.
Yet there remains a philosophical tension. Even if we accept that feelings are biological imperatives generated by the brainstem, we are still circling the hard problem of consciousness. Why does a specific neural circuit regulating homeostasis feel like anything at all? We can map the entire process of a burned finger traveling to the periaqueductal gray, but the qualitative experience of the burn remains unexplained by the physical mechanics.
Mark Solms attempts to address the hard problem by arguing that philosophers like David Chalmers overlooked affect in their formulations. Solms suggests that if you start with the premise that consciousness is fundamentally about feeling the biological imperative to survive, the hard problem becomes less daunting. The organism must feel the deficit because the feeling is the mechanism of action. However, critics maintain that pointing to the evolutionary utility of a feeling does not explain its subjective ontology. We know why a thermostat regulates temperature, but we do not assume the thermostat feels cold. The leap from a biological regulatory mechanism to a subjective lived experience is still a massive conceptual gap.
The affective approach fundamentally alters the starting point of the inquiry. Instead of looking at the pinnacle of human cognition, our ability to reason, speak, and reflect, it looks at the basement. It suggests that the sophisticated architecture of the cerebral cortex was built on top of a pre-existing foundation of sentience.
The cortex provides the high-definition resolution. It gives us the ability to pinpoint the exact location of a pain, to remember the event that caused it, and to take steps to avoid it in the future. It gives us the visual and auditory details of our environment. But the affective theorists maintain that the cortex is dark without the brainstem. The brainstem provides the light. The brainstem provides the feeling of existence that permeates all those high-definition cortical representations.
If these theories hold true, the story of consciousness is not a recent development tied to human intelligence. It is a much older story. It is a story of life developing a way to monitor itself, protect itself, and sustain itself. It does not begin with thought or attention or complex prediction models. It begins with the simplest and most profound experience of all, the feeling of being alive. If this conversation shifted how you think about the origins of your own experience, send this episode to a friend and keep the discussion
Introducing Iris, A Journey Through the Unknown in Pursuit of the Ultimate Truth by Emmett, a compelling exploration that will captivate the discerning reader seeking answers beyond the ordinary. Imagine standing on the threshold between the known and the unseen. Emmett's Iris leads you through labyrinths of philosophy, spirituality, and science, challenging every presumption and uncovering gems of wisdom that lie buried in the everyday. With measured eloquence and sharp analysis, Emmett constructs a narrative both personal and universal, inviting readers into a realm where questions matter more than answers. Iris is not merely a book, it is an invitation to awaken, confront uncertainties, and define your ultimate truth. Entrepreneurs, professionals, thinkers, and seekers, Iris is the essential volume for those who desire clarity amidst complexity, crafted for minds unafraid of embarking on a profound journey. Now available on Amazon. Discover a pathway to enlightenment, fresh perspective, and self-realization. Visit www.emmettpublications.com to learn more. Iris, where the unknown becomes the first step towards your truth.